Getting fired from Maxwell Industries felt like having the ground yanked from beneath my feet. One moment I was sitting at my desk, reviewing chemical formulas for our latest project. The next I was being escorted out by security while Marcus Maxwell, our boss of 5 years, watched with cold satisfaction. "Poor performance," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We need innovators here, Olivia. People who can bring fresh ideas to the table. Not just," he gestured vaguely at my workspace, "maintain the status quo." I stood there, clutching my cardboard box of belongings, feeling the eyes of my former colleagues burning into my back. 5 years of dedication, countless late nights, and breakthrough discoveries, all dismissed with 2 cruel words: poor performance. What Marcus didn't know then was that his decision to fire me would unravel everything he built. Sometimes the universe has a strange way of revealing truth, and in my case, it came in the form of a dusty old box in my grandfather's attic. 2 weeks after my unceremonious dismissal, I found myself helping my mother clean out Grandpa Henry's house. He had passed away 3 years ago, but my grandmother had only recently felt ready to sort through his belongings. As I climbed into the musty attic, memories of my grandfather flooded back: his infectious laugh, the way his eyes sparkled when he talked about his research, and most of all, his unwavering belief in me. "Be careful with those boxes, dear," my grandmother called from below. "Your grandfather kept everything from his research days there." I smiled, remembering how Grandpa Henry would tell me stories about his time as a chemical engineer. He had worked on numerous projects throughout his career, but never achieved the recognition he deserved. "Too honest for his own good," my grandmother would say, a hint of pride mixed with sadness in her voice. As I moved aside some old photo albums, a metal lockbox caught my eye. It was tucked away in the corner, covered in decades of dust. The key was taped to the bottom, along with a note in my grandfather's familiar scrawl: "For the right moment." Inside, I found stacks of notebooks, carefully dated and organized. But what made my heart stop was a familiar symbol on one of the folders, the same symbol I had seen countless times at Maxwell Industries. With trembling hands, I opened the folder and began to read. Page after page of detailed research notes, chemical compositions, and experimental data filled the folders. The dates went back 30 years, but the formulas were exactly what Marcus had presented as his own groundbreaking discovery last year. The very project that had earned him millions in investor funding and countless industry accolades. My mind raced back to all the times Marcus had shut me out of key meetings, the way he had jealously guarded certain aspects of the research. It all made sense now. He hadn't innovated anything, he had stolen my grandfather's life's work. I sat there in the dim attic light, surrounded by dust motes and decades of hidden truth, as fury built inside me. Marcus hadn't fired me because of poor performance. He had fired me because I was getting too close to his secret, too familiar with the research that he had stolen. When I confronted my grandmother with the discovery, tears welled up in her eyes. "Your grandfather suspected someone had stolen his research," she whispered, "but he could never prove it. The company he worked for, Maxwell Sr.'s small startup, they claimed all his work was their property. He fought it for years, but—" She trailed off, her hands trembling slightly. "Maxwell Sr.?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Marcus's father." She nodded. "They were just getting started then. Henry's research, it was revolutionary, but they forced him out, claimed everything. It broke his heart." I spread the papers across my grandmother's kitchen table. The yellowed pages contained not just research notes, but detailed records of my grandfather's correspondence with the company, his attempts to protect his work, and most importantly, his original patent applications, filed months before Maxwell Sr. had claimed the discoveries as his own. "Does Marcus know?" I asked. "About his father stealing Grandpa's research?" My grandmother's expression hardened. "Oh, he knows. He was just a boy then. But he was there when his father came to our house, threatening legal action if Henry didn't back down." I thought about Marcus's smug face as he announced his breakthrough last year, how he had accepted awards and praise for innovations he had stolen, how he had fired me, probably fearing I might recognize something in the formulas, might make connections he couldn't risk. But he had made one crucial mistake. He didn't know about this lockbox. He didn't know that my grandfather had kept proof, irrefutable evidence that the technology Marcus was about to license for millions belonged to someone else. I checked my phone calendar. The big investor meeting was in 3 days. Marcus had been bragging about it for weeks before my firing, how he was going to license his innovation to major manufacturers, a deal worth over $40 million. Grandma, I said, carefully placing the documents back in the lockbox. I need to borrow these for a few days. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Show them who really deserves the credit, dear. Do what your grandfather couldn't. That night, I stayed up late, meticulously scanning every document, every note, every piece of evidence. I organized them chronologically, building an airtight case that proved my grandfather had developed the technology decades ago. Then I made 3 calls. First, to James Morton, a patent lawyer who had been my grandfather's friend. He listened quietly as I explained everything, then said 6 words that made me smile. I've been waiting for this day. The second call was to Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter who had been sniffing around Maxwell Industries for months, suspecting something wasn't quite right with their sudden technological leap. The third call was to my old mentor at the company, Dr. Marcus Williams. He had retired 2 years ago, but I knew he had his suspicions about Marcus's sudden genius. Come by tomorrow, he said after I explained. There's something you need to see. As I finally lay in bed that night, surrounded by copies of my grandfather's research, I felt a strange sense of calm. Marcus thought he had won when he fired me. He thought he had protected his secret. But tomorrow, I would start putting the pieces together. And in 3 days, when he stood in front of those investors, ready to sell his stolen innovation, I would be there, with proof that would destroy everything he had built on lies. I closed my eyes, remembering my grandfather's warm smile, his constant encouragement, his belief in doing what was right even when it was hard. This is for you, Grandpa, I whispered into the darkness. Justice is finally coming. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for beginning my grandfather's vindication. I dressed carefully, not in the casual clothes I'd worn since being fired, but in a sharp charcoal suit that meant business. Today, I would start gathering the ammunition I needed to expose Marcus Maxwell's fraud. Dr. Williams's house was exactly as I remembered it from department parties, a modest suburban home with a meticulously maintained garden. He opened the door before I could knock, his face grave but his eyes bright with purpose. I've been waiting for someone to figure it out, he said, leading me to his home office. I knew Marcus didn't develop that technology himself. The man barely understands basic chemical engineering principles. He pulled out a thick folder from his desk. I've been keeping records. For the next 2 hours, we pored over his documentation. Dr. Williams had methodically noted every inconsistency in Marcus's claims, every impossibility in his timeline. He fired me too, he revealed, when I started asking too many questions about his research methodology. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed more. Sarah Chen met me for coffee that afternoon, her reporter's notebook already full of suspicious details about Maxwell Industries' meteoric rise. The timeline never made sense, she said, tapping her pen thoughtfully. A small chemical company suddenly developing revolutionary technology. With no previous research trail, no published papers, no patent history in that area. James Morton's office was our final stop. The patent lawyer's eyes gleamed as he examined my grandfather's original documentation. This is exactly what we needed, he said, placing the papers carefully into his briefcase. I always knew Henry was the real inventor. Now we can prove it. We worked late into the night, preparing documents, cross-referencing dates, building an ironclad case. When I finally returned home, exhausted but satisfied, I found my grandmother waiting up for me. I found something else, she said softly, holding out a small leather journal. Your grandfather's personal diary from that time. He wrote about everything, the research, the theft, what it did to him. She pressed it into my hands, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Make him remember who he really was. The morning of the investor meeting, I arrived at Maxwell Industries an hour early. Security didn't stop me, they hadn't yet updated their systems to remove my access. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. The conference room where Marcus would make his presentation was already prepared. Sleek displays showcased the revolutionary technology he had stolen from my grandfather. Presentation folders sat at each place setting, filled with graphs and projections of future profits. Everything looked perfect, polished, professional. I took my seat in the back corner, heart pounding but hands steady. James Morton, my grandfather's old friend and patent lawyer, sat beside me, his briefcase containing 30 years of truth. Sarah Chen, the investigative reporter, positioned herself near the door, notebook ready. Dr. Williams would arrive with the investors. His reputation in the industry had guaranteed him an invitation. At exactly 9 a.m., Marcus strode in, followed by a group of well-dressed investors. He looked exactly as I remembered: expensive suit, carefully styled hair, and that same smug smile that he'd worn while firing me. He was so busy greeting potential investors that he didn't notice me at first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth with practiced charm, "today marks a historic moment in chemical engineering. What I'm about to show you will revolutionize the industry." That's when he saw me. For a fraction of a second, his perfect composure cracked. Fear flashed across his face before he forced his smile back into place. "I believe you know my former employee, Olivia Parker," he said smoothly, trying to regain control. "Though I'm afraid she's not authorized to be here." I stood up, my grandmother's words echoing in my mind. Make them remember who he really was. "Actually, Mr. Maxwell," I said, my voice clear and strong, "I have every right to be here, especially since you're about to license technology that belongs to my family." The room fell silent. Investors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Marcus's face hardened. "Security," he snapped, reaching for his phone. "We have an intruder." "Before you make that call," James Morton stood up, opening his briefcase, "you might want to examine these documents. Original patent applications filed 30 years ago by Henry Parker, complete with chemical compositions that match your breakthrough exactly." Marcus's face went pale as James began distributing copies to the investors. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. "These documents are clearly fabricated." "Are they?" Dr. Williams spoke up from his seat among the investors. "I've been studying your research claims, Marcus. The timeline never added up. The technological leap was too great. But now," he held up my grandfather's papers, "everything makes perfect sense." Sarah Chen stepped forward, her reporter's notebook open. "Mr. Maxwell, would you care to comment on how your father acquired this technology from Henry Parker's lab in 1993, or why Mr. Parker's name was removed from all official documentation?" The investors were muttering now, flipping through pages of evidence. Marcus's carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "This is absurd," he sputtered, his composure completely gone. "You can't prove anything. The company owns all research conducted." I pulled out my grandfather's personal journal. "Page 127. I said, opening to the marked page. "April 15, 1993. Today Maxwell came to my lab with lawyers. Said everything belongs to the company, but they don't know about the backup documentation I've kept. Proof that this was my work before I ever joined them." Marcus lunged for the journal, but I held it out of reach. "Careful," I said quietly. "You wouldn't want to add theft and assault to your list of crimes." The lead investor, a stern-faced woman, stood up. "Mr. Maxwell, I believe this meeting is over. Our firm will be conducting a thorough investigation into these allegations." One by one, the investors filed out, leaving Marcus standing alone at the front of his pristine conference room, surrounded by the evidence of his family's deception. "You're finished," he hissed, his face contorted with rage. "I'll bury you in lawsuits. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." I smiled, thinking of my grandfather's strength, his integrity, his quiet certainty that truth would eventually prevail. "No, Marcus, you're finished. The truth was always going to come out. My grandfather made sure of that." 48 hours later, Maxwell Industries was in chaos. Sarah Chen's expose hit the front page, detailing how Marcus and his father had built their empire on stolen research. The company's stock plummeted. The investors withdrew, lawsuits were filed, and federal investigators began examining decades of patents. A week after the confrontation, I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, watching her read the news coverage. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she traced my grandfather's name in the headline. "He would be so proud of you," she whispered, "not just for exposing the truth, but for how you did it. With dignity, with evidence, with justice rather than vengeance." The doorbell rang. It was James Morton, holding a thick envelope. The patent office wants to formally restore Henry's name to the innovations, he said, smiling. And there's more. The new board of Maxwell Industries, what's left of it, they want to make things right. The settlement they offered was substantial full recognition of my grandfather's work, significant financial compensation, and most importantly, a position for me heading up the newly renamed Parker Laboratories. Marcus, I heard, had fled the country, facing multiple investigations into intellectual property theft. His carefully constructed empire had crumbled, built as it was on lies and stolen dreams. In my new office, my grandfather's old lab, renovated and modernized, I hung two things: his original patent application, finally bearing his name, and a small note I found in his journal. Truth is like one of my chemical compounds, he'd written. It may lie dormant for years, but under the right conditions, it will always come to light. I touched the frame gently, thinking of the man who had taught me about integrity, about patience, about standing up for what's right. Marcus had fired me thinking he was protecting his secret. Instead, he had set in motion the very events that would expose his fraud. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it waits in dusty attics and forgotten lockboxes. But it always finds its way to the light. The company flourishes now, built on honest innovation rather than stolen glory. Every morning when I walk into the building and see Parker Laboratories on the wall, I think of my grandfather, his brilliant mind, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief that right would eventually triumph over wrong. Marcus thought firing me would silence me. Instead, it gave me the freedom to uncover the truth, to reclaim my grandfather's legacy, and to build something new from the ashes of deception. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's justice, served not cold, but with the warm certainty that truth will always prevail. Last week, a young intern came to me with concerns about some data that didn't quite add up. I listened carefully, remembering how Marcus had dismissed similar concerns. Then I thanked her for her integrity and launched a full investigation, because that's what my grandfather would have done. That's his real legacy, not just the innovations he created, but the values he instilled. In the end, Marcus didn't just lose his company and his reputation. He lost the chance to learn the most valuable lesson my grandfather ever taught me. Success built on lies will always crumble. But truth, like the best chemical compounds, is indestructible.